Hi there, it's me, SpongeBob. I'm really happy you're here. Welcome to Sleepy Sponge Lore, a quiet place under the sea, where stories drift like bubbles and the secrets of Bikini Bottom glow softly in the dark. Here we take things slow, no rushing, no noise, just the gentle rhythm of the waves. So snuggle in, take a deep breath, and let the ocean carry you into dreams.
No one ever knew when Squidward's story truly began, because the sea has a way of softening the edges of time. In the stillness of his earliest memories, before the bustling sounds of neighbors, before the endless chatter of yellow laughter or the heavy sighs that would follow him through his days, there was only the quiet. The kind of quiet that lingers like a low tide, heavy and slow, carrying the sound of things not yet spoken. It was in that hush that something unusual stirred inside him, an ache, not sharp, but patient, as though his heart was listening for his song it had not yet heard. As a child, Squidward had always seemed older than his years. The other little ones darted about in bursts of colour and noise, chasing bubbles that popped as quickly as their attention. But Squidward lingered. He walked slower, he watched longer, and his gaze often drifted to places where no one else bothered to look. He would stand at the edge of a sandy street while the others played tag, his long arms folded, his mind swimming elsewhere. Sometimes, when the world grew too loud, he would find a patch of smooth coral, press his back against it, and close his eyes. There he listened, not to words, not to laughter, but to something softer, the distant hum of the ocean's heart, a rhythm he could never quite explain. One day, in that hush, he found an object half buried in the sand. It was old, weathered, its surface dulled by time. When he lifted it, brushing away the clinging grains, he discovered it was a clarinet, cracked along the edges, fragile and faintly glowing with some forgotten history. Most children would have tossed it aside, seeking brighter toys or faster games. But Squidward cradled it as though it were something living, something meant for him alone. The first time he placed it to his lips, no melody came, only a hollow whisper, a breath against emptiness. Yet even that empty sound filled him with wonder, as though the clarinet had spoken in a secret tongue. From that day on, Squidward returned to the clarinet again and again. He practiced in secret, coaxing from it strange notes that rose like bubbles, trembling and imperfect, yet carrying the weight of his unspoken feelings. The other children laughed when they heard, their ears trained only to the simple songs sung in schools or shouted in play. To them, Squidward's sounds were nothing but noise. But to Squidward, they were fragments of a language no one else seemed to know. Each note a small piece of the quiet aching within him, each breath a release. At night, when his little house dimmed to shadow, he would press the clarinet to his lips and let the ocean outside become his audience. He imagined the sea creatures drifting closer, pausing in their wanderings to listen. He imagined the tides themselves shifting with his music, carrying his notes away into places he would never see. He never thought of applause, never thought of fame, only of filling the silence with something gentle, something his heart had been waiting to share. But it wasn't only the music that grew from that child. It was the way he began to see the world around him, differently than others. Where his peers saw only games, Squidward noticed patterns, the way the coral bent toward the light, the way bubbles formed spirals before breaking. He began to draw them too, sketching with scraps of chalk, tracing lines that curled like melodies across stone. His drawings were crooked, unfinished, but they carried the same secret pulse as his music. He was not always understood, but he was always reaching, always listening to something beyond the noise of ordinary days. Still, loneliness often pressed against him. The other children teased him for his long silences, for his strange habits, for the way he carried that battered clarinet everywhere he went. He pretended not to care, folding his arms and turning away, but when night came, he would press the clarinet closer, as if it alone knew the truth of him. The ache inside him softened only when he played as though the instrument whispered, "You are not as alone as you feel," and yet, in his earliest years, there was a single moment when that loneliness cracked, if only for a while. It happened one evening, when the sky dimmed into lavender, and the sea took on that soft, dreamlike glow. A small figure, another child he barely knew, wandered close and sat beside him. They said nothing at first. Squidward played a shaky melody, and to his surprise, the other child didn't laugh or run. They simply listened, their eyes gentle, their head tilted as though they understood. When the song ended, the child whispered, "It sounds like the sea is singing back." That was all. No praise, no teasing. Just a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps Squidward's strange sounds belonged to something larger than himself. He never forgot that moment. He would carry it through his life like a faint lantern, dim but steady, a reminder that even in the loneliness, someone had once listened without judgment. It was not a grand friendship, not a story of two souls forever bound. It was simpler, softer. Just a single night when his music was met with silence that wasn't empty, but full of acceptance. As the years drifted onward, that memory returned to him again and again, especially in times when the world felt heavy. It became a seed planted deep within him, guiding his hands whenever they trembled over the clarinet, whispering to him whenever he doubted his place. That one small kindness, unnoticed by everyone else, had rooted itself in his soul. And so, in the quiet beginning of Squidward's tale, there was more than loneliness. There was a clarinet rescued from the sand, there was the hush of the ocean, and there was the single night when someone truly listened. These were the first pieces of his secret life, the foundations upon which every sigh, every song, every quiet longing would later rest. The memory of that evening lingered with him, like a seashell held close to the ear, carrying whispers of something far greater than itself. Though the days that followed returned to their usual rhythm of noise and misunderstanding, Squidward often found himself chasing the comfort of that brief companionship. He would sit by the window of his quiet little house, clarinet in hand, replaying the way those simple words had made the world feel softer, less sharp around the edges. It was a fleeting kindness, but in his young mind, it became proof that perhaps he wasn't entirely invisible, that maybe the strange song he carried belonged to the sea and to someone else, too. Still, most of his childhood unfolded in silence, wrapped in the long shadows of an empty home. His parents were kind in their way, but distant, present more as figures passing through hallways than companions who understood the stormy tides of his thoughts. They encouraged him in practical things, asking about lessons or reminding him of chores, but when he lifted his clarinet to play, they seldom lingered to listen. Their polite nods told him his music was a hobby, not a voice, and so he kept much of himself tucked away, safe inside the walls of imagination. The house itself seemed to echo his solitude. The walls were a pale blue-grey, like the underside of the sea before dawn, and they gave little warmth. Yet to Squidward, the space became a sanctuary. He filled it with sketches, with small carvings of shells, with the clutter of unfinished ideas. Each object was imperfect, sometimes crooked or smudged, but together they formed a world only he could understand. When loneliness pressed too heavily, he would wander from one creation to the next, tracing lines with his fingertips, reminding himself that he could bring something into existence where there had been nothing before. But outside those walls, the world kept pressing in. The other children carried a brightness he found both fascinating and exhausting. They laughed in great bursts, their games loud and fast, their joys spilling over like foamy waves. He envied their ease, even as he shrank from it. Whenever he tried to join, his words came awkward, his movements stiff. And so he would retreat again, pretending disinterest, when in truth his chest ached with the wish to belong. Sometimes he caught himself watching them too long, longing woven into the corners of his gaze. And sometimes they noticed, responding with teasing words that burned quietly in his heart. In these moments, the clarinet became more than an instrument. It became a shield, a voice, and a companion. The notes he drew from it were uneven, but they carried pieces of him no words could manage. When laughter left him behind, he would play until his chest no longer felt heavy. When the world ignored him, he played until the silence turned gentle instead of cruel. It was not perfection that kept him practicing, but the way the sound reminded him he existed, that even if no one else saw him, his music did. There were nights when he played so softly that the very air in his room seemed to lean closer, listening. On one of those nights, as the moonlight slipped across his floor, he imagined the sea creatures pausing in their drifting to hear him. A school of fish passing by, tails flicking in rhythm. A jellyfish glowing brighter for a moment as though nodding in approval. Even the ocean currents themselves swaying to carry his notes further. He did not need an audience of people when the whole sea could be imagined as his stage. The thought comforted him, wrapping around him like a lullaby woven from salt and light. And yet, as he grew a little older, the weight of being different pressed harder. Schoolwork demanded he sit in rows, repeat lessons, and fit into boxes that seemed too narrow for him. His teachers praised the tidy answers of others, the ones who could solve sums quickly or recite facts without hesitation. Squidward, meanwhile, would find himself staring at the chalkboard, hearing the faint echo of a melody forming in his mind instead. He was not careless, but his thoughts wandered elsewhere, towards shapes, colors, sounds. When the reports came, home, they spoke of potential unfulfilled, a phrase that echoed in his ears like a judgment he could not escape. But there were rare, quiet triumphs. Once, when a teacher asked the class to bring something meaningful for show and tell, Squidward brought his clarinet. He had prepared for days, practicing until his arms ached, determined to share a melody that might make them understand. When he played, the classroom fell silent, not the silence of indifference but of surprise. The notes were shaky, yes, but they held a haunting sweetness, like the hush before dawn. For a moment, everyone listened, really listened, the way that child by the shore once had. And in that pause, Squidward felt seen. But just as quickly, the moment ended. A giggle broke the silence, then another, until the room erupted in laughter. They didn't know how to hold what he offered, and he didn't know how to explain. He lowered the clarinet, cheeks burning, heart heavy. That night, though, when he played again in the safety of his room, he remembered the silence before the laughter, the breathless stillness of 30 children listening, if only for a few seconds. That stillness mattered more than their laughter. It told him the music had reached them, if only briefly, and that was enough to keep him playing. The days stretched onward, one folding into the next, with Squidward caught between longing and solitude. His quirks grew into habits, his habits into traits, until he seemed destined to be the quiet boy on the edge of things. And yet, in the quiet corners of his world, the beginnings of something deeper were taking root. His art and his music were more than distractions now. They were pieces of a secret language waiting for the day when someone might finally hear it and understand. The seasons of childhood drifted by like tides, each one carrying Squidward a little further from the boy he had been, a little closer to the young dreamer he was becoming. The clarinet, though battered and imperfect, became his anchor. Its wood smelled faintly of salt and age, and though its surface was cracked, it felt alive in his hands, as though it had been waiting for him all along. He began to notice that his time with it was not simply practice, but a kind of conversation. When the day weighed heavily upon him, the notes came out low and wandering. When he dared to hope, they brightened, floating upward like bubbles caught in sunlight. The clarinet reflected him back to himself, showing him what words could not. But music was not the only way he tried to give shape to his inner life. The chalk sketches that once filled corners of his room began to spill outward, growing in size and ambition. He drew swirls and spirals on discarded scraps of shell, layered colors into strange patterns on old driftwood, and sometimes etched designs in the sand, knowing the waves would wash them away before dawn. Each creation was fleeting, but the act of shaping something from nothing filled him with a quiet strength. It was as though he was learning to leave small marks upon a world that often passed him by, proof that he had been here, even if only for a moment. Of course, the teasing continued. The other children did not understand why anyone would spend hours bent over chalk lines when there were games to play or jellyfish to chase. Their laughter grew sharper as they grew older, no longer the innocent giggles of youth, but the cutting tones of children learning how to measure one another. Squidward responded in the only way he knew, by folding deeper into himself. His arms crossed tighter, his sighs lengthened, and his words became laced with sharpness, a shield to hide the hurt beneath. Yet, in the evenings when the house dimmed to quiet, that shield fell away. Alone with his clarinet, he allowed the ache to turn into music, into sketches, into dreams. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Squidward wandered beyond the usual streets, following the pull of the tide. The sand was cool beneath his feet, the sea spread wide and endless, and the sky shimmered in dusky pinks. He carried his clarinet with him, tucked under his arm like a trusted friend. Finding a smooth rock, he sat, letting the hush of the evening settle around him. He began to play, not for an audience, not even for himself, but for the horizon. The notes drifted out in long, trembling threads, weaving themselves into the fabric of twilight. For a while, he thought he was alone. But as the melody lingered, a soft rustling reached his ears. Turning, he saw a cluster of small sea creatures, tiny fish, curious and still, their silver scales catching the fading light. They hovered there as if listening. Squidward's heart skipped, and for a moment his hands faltered. But then he continued, slower now, gentler, letting the music flow as though it belonged to the ocean itself. The fish did not scatter. They circled instead, moving in time with the notes, and for the first time in his life, Squidward felt as though his music had found an audience that understood it completely. The ocean, patient and infinite, seemed to echo his song back to him. He carried that moment home like a secret. No one else knew, and perhaps no one would ever believe him, but it mattered more than words could capture. It told him something important, that his music was not wasted, not meaningless. Even if others laughed, even if they failed to see, the sea itself had listened. That thought became a quiet mantra, a strength he returned to again and again. Still the loneliness lingered. Nights stretched long and days often blurred into the same sighs and silences. Yet within him, something had begun to take root. The key idea that his music and his art were not simply pastimes, but pieces of who he was meant to be. It wasn't about applause or recognition, though a part of him longed for it. It was about the strange necessity of it, the way his heart seemed lighter when he created, the way the silence turned warm instead of cold when filled with his song. He began to notice, too, how his senses seemed tuned differently than others. While his peers rushed through life, Squidward lingered over the subtleties, the faint shimmer of light on a seashell, the way shadows stretched across a wall, the rhythm of bubbles rising from the sand. These details mattered to him, not because anyone else saw them, but because they were proof of beauty hidden in plain sight. They reminded him that life, even in its loneliness, held quiet wonders. Yet as childhood edged toward youth, he also began to feel the sharp tug of contradiction. Part of him wanted to withdraw entirely, to keep his inner world safe and untouched. But another part yearned for connection, for someone to share in the music, the sketches, the quiet marvels. He did not know how to bridge that distance. So he walked it carefully, one foot in solitude, one foot hesitating toward others, never quite belonging fully in either place. And though he did not yet know it, this tension between solitude and the longing for belonging would become one of the central rhythms of his life. For now, he carried it gently, like an unresolved chord in his music, waiting for the day it might finally find its harmony. That unresolved chord lingered in him, humming quietly through the years as he grew taller, his steps slower, his gaze more withdrawn. The world around him seemed to move too quickly, filled with laughter he could not join, and games that spun without him. Yet his own world deepened, becoming richer in its solitude. His room, once a simple shelter, had become something more, a gallery of half-finished sketches, fragments of music written on scraps of paper, and the warm glow of candlelight reflecting off shells he had collected. It was a sanctuary where his inner voice could speak freely, even if no one else cared to listen. Still, as the seasons passed, there were moments that pulled him outward, if only briefly. One came in the form of a neighbor who moved in just down the street, a child around his age, bright and restless, whose laughter often drifted across the water. Squidward watched from his window as they decorated their home with splashes of color, seashells strung into garlands, and windows that always seemed to glow with warmth. Compared to his own quiet, shadowed home, it looked like a place where stories were always being told, where every evening was filled with voices and light. He wondered, not for the first time, what it might feel like to belong to such a world. But Squidward did not rush forward. Instead, he lingered at the edges, clarinet in hand, letting his music speak for him when words failed. On soft evenings, he would play by his window, hoping, without fully admitting it, that someone might pause to listen. Sometimes he imagined he saw movement in the neighbor's window, as though someone had turned their head for a moment. But there was never a knock at his door, never a word of acknowledgement. The distance remained, and so did the ache. It was during these in-between years that Squidward began to notice something shifting within him. His music was no longer only an outlet for loneliness. It was becoming a mirror for the small fragments of joy he discovered too. The quiet beauty of a sunrise spreading golden light across the water found its way into his melodies. The calm rhythm of waves lapping against the shore gave his songs a steady heartbeat. Even the faint kindness of a stranger offering a smile at the market lingered in his notes. Though his clarinet's voice was imperfect, it carried these moments like fragile treasures, weaving them into something that felt larger than himself. Yet, with every step toward self-expression came the sting of misunderstanding. At school, when asked what he wanted to be, Squidward answered honestly, an artist, a musician, someone who could spend his life shaping beauty from silence. The class erupted in laughter, and the teacher's polite smile told him all he needed to know. Practicality was valued, dreams were not. He returned home that day with a heaviness that seemed too large for his chest, his clarinet tucked under his arm like a wounded bird. That night, however, he played more fiercely than ever. His notes trembled, cracked, and rose unevenly, but they carried the full force of his defiance. In the stillness afterward, he realized something. Even if no one else believed in his dreams, they were still his. They mattered because they were the truest reflection of who he was. And though the world might never applaud, the sea would still listen. That was enough for now. In the midst of this quiet struggle, another unexpected moment of connection arrived. One evening, as he played outside under the stars, he noticed someone standing nearby. It was the same neighbor whose laughter often floated across the street. They did not speak, did not tease, did not interrupt. They simply stood in the dim glow, listening. When Squidward finished, they gave a small nod, a soft smile, and walked away without a word. The encounter lasted only minutes, but it etched itself into Squidward's memory. It reminded him of that earlier moment by the shore when another child had whispered that the sea was singing back. Twice now in his life, someone had listened. Twice, his music had been received not with laughter, but with silence full of meaning. Those moments, rare as they were, became threads he held tightly to. They gave him reason to keep playing, to keep sketching, to keep breathing life into the secret world he carried inside. Even as the laughter of others cut deep, even as teachers dismissed his ambitions, he knew there was a place, however small, for his voice. As Squidward moved further into adolescence, he began to understand that this balance between rejection and fleeting acceptance, between solitude and the longing to be heard, was shaping him. It was teaching him resilience, though he would not have used that word then. It was giving his sighs depth, his eyes a quiet weight, and his music a tenderness that came only from wounds, carried gently rather than hidden. And while he could not yet see it, these were the roots of the person he would become, an artist of quiet persistence, a soul who found meaning not in crowds or applause, but in the rare and precious moments when someone paused long enough to truly hear. The days of Squidward's adolescence unfolded in a rhythm that was both familiar and restless, like the tide that returned again and again, yet always shifted its shape. His clarinet remained a constant companion, its worn wood growing smoother beneath his fingers with every passing year. It had once been a toy salvaged from the sand, but now it had become almost an extension of himself, a vessel for the feelings he could not otherwise share. Each note carried pieces of him, his loneliness, his small joys, his longing for recognition, and though the world around him often failed to notice, the instrument never failed to listen. Yet as he grew older, the divide between his inner world and the bustling lives of those around him widened. His peers discovered ambitions that fit neatly into the patterns expected of them. Steady jobs, clear goals, laughter that seemed to spill so easily in groups. Squidward watched them with a mix of curiosity and distance, wondering how it felt to walk so confidently in step with others. When they teased him, he responded with sharp words or cold silence, but inside he carried the sting. He often told himself he preferred solitude, that he needed no one else, but when he pressed his clarinet to his lips, the notes betrayed him. They wavered with longing, rose with questions he could never quite put into words, and sank into sighs that filled his little home with quiet ache. Still he was not without moments of connection. The neighbor, who had once paused to listen, sometimes lingered again, always wordless, always respectful of the space between them. Their silence was a comfort, proof that not every presence demanded noise. Squidward never asked their name, never invited them closer, but he carried those glances and nods as though they were gifts. It was a fragile thread of belonging, and fragile threads meant more to him than others could guess. His art, too, began to grow in new directions. What had once been doodles in chalk or sand became more deliberate. Paintings on driftwood, delicate carvings in coral, pieces that carried the same softness as his music. He filled his room with them until it seemed less like a boy's bedroom and more like a small gallery, though one only he would ever see. Sometimes he imagined opening the door, inviting others in, showing them the world he had built in secret. But the fear of laughter, the memory of cruel giggles in the classroom, always stopped him. And so the gallery remained private, a treasure hidden even from those closest to him. There was a certain comfort in routine. Each morning he rose to the same pale light filtering through his window. Each day he carried himself through lessons and small tasks with the same sighs. Each evening he returned to his clarinet, to his sketches, to the sanctuary of creation. The predictability should have been dull, but within it lay something soothing, a steady current that carried him forward even when the world felt heavy. He began to see that this rhythm, quiet though it was the foundation of his life. It did not matter if others did not understand. His music understood, his art understood, the sea understood. And yet, beneath the comfort of routine, a restlessness stirred. He could not deny the part of him that longed for something more. Sometimes he caught himself staring out his window longer than usual, watching the laughter of others, wondering what it might feel like to step into their warmth. At other times he imagined leaving altogether, wandering far beyond the familiar streets, seeking a place where his music might be met with silence that was not indifference but wonder. These thoughts lingered like tides against the shore, always pulling, never quite strong enough to sweep him away, but growing. It was during one of these restless evenings that Squidward experienced a shift he would never forget. The moon was high, casting silver paths across the waves. He sat outside, clarinet in hand, playing a melody that had come to him unbidden, soft, wistful, threaded with yearning. As he played, he felt something stirring not only around him but within him. The air seemed to thicken, the sea to lean closer. It was as though the ocean itself was listening, truly listening, not as an audience, but as an old friend. For a moment, the music no longer belonged to him. It flowed through him, greater than him, carried outward to places he would never see. When the final note faded, Squidward sat in the stillness, breathless. He had played before many times, but this was different. This felt like a conversation, a dialogue with something vast and eternal. The loneliness inside him eased, not because he had been heard by others, but because he had touched something beyond them. He did not have words for it, but he knew it mattered. That night, as he returned to his room, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. His life might never be filled with applause or crowded rooms. He might always stand at the edges, half invisible to those around him. But he had something they did not, a way of speaking to the sea, of pouring his heart into sound and color and shape. That, he realized, was its own kind of belonging. And though he could not yet see how, these small realizations, woven from solitude, longing, and fleeting moments of connection, were shaping him into someone stronger than he knew, someone who, in his own quiet way, would carry the secret weight of beauty wherever he went. The following days after that moonlit evening carried with them a different kind of weight. Squidward felt it in the air, a subtle shift that seemed to press against his skin, as though the sea itself was waiting for him to return to that hidden conversation. He could not ignore it, though he tried. He told himself it was only a trick of the night, a passing feeling born of his own imagination. Yet when he lifted his clarinet again, the memory of that moment lingered, an ache in his chest, a tremor in his hands. The notes that spilled out were no longer just practice, no longer just a way of filling silence. They carried a searching quality, as if he were calling out to the same unseen presence that had listened before. In his daily life, however, nothing seemed to have changed. The streets bustled as they always did. Neighbors greeted one another with the same small courtesies, and his peers still treated him with that half-dismissive air he had come to expect. If anything, his sense of separation grew sharper. He noticed the way others shared stories so easily, how laughter bound them together in ways he could never quite join. He longed for that ease, but whenever he tried to step closer, words caught in his throat, and he retreated again. Instead, he poured everything he could not say into his art. His sketches grew more elaborate, his small carvings more intricate, as though each piece was a secret he dared not speak aloud. It was during one such evening, while shaping a small figure from driftwood, that he noticed something strange. The carving had begun as a simple shape, a practice of the hand, but as the wood gave way beneath his knife, he realized it was becoming something else, something familiar. The curve of its face, the hollow eyes, the faint impression of a smile. It was himself. The realization startled him, and for a long time he sat staring at the unfinished figure. He wondered what it meant that without planning, his hands had chosen to carve his own likeness. Perhaps it was a reflection of the loneliness he felt, a quiet attempt to give himself company. Or perhaps it was a sign that he was beginning, in some small way, to see himself more clearly. When he finished, he placed the small figure beside his clarinet, as though the two belonged together. It became a silent companion, a witness to his music, and somehow its presence comforted him. He did not tell anyone about it. Some things, he decided, were not meant to be shared. As the weeks passed, his bond with the sea deepened. He found himself drawn more often to the shore, clarinet in hand, waiting for the quiet of night when the world grew still. Each time he played, the same feeling returned, the sense of being heard, of being met by something larger than himself. The melodies that came to him were different now, more fluid, more daring, as though they were shaped not only by his heart, but by the rhythm of the waves. Sometimes he thought he saw the water move in response, subtle ripples stretching outward in time with his notes, though he could never be sure. These secret encounters gave him strength in ways he had not expected. The sharp words of others stung less. The weight of solitude felt lighter. He began to carry himself with a quiet confidence, not the boastful kind he sometimes envied in others, but a steadiness born of knowing he was not entirely alone. He had the sea, his art, his music, and that was enough. But with strength came new questions. What was it that listened in the stillness? Was it the sea itself, or something within him that reached beyond? Was he meant to do more with this gift, to carry it farther than the lonely corners of his room? The thought both excited and frightened him. He had lived so long in the shadow of others' indifference that the idea of stepping forward felt impossible. And yet, each time the tide whispered back to him, he felt the possibility grow. One evening, as he returned from the shore, he passed by a small group gathered around a street musician. The performer was not especially skilled, but they played with energy, and the crowd clapped along, smiling, laughing, alive in the shared moment. Squidward stopped in the shadows, clarinet case in hand, watching. He imagined himself standing there, pouring out the melodies that came to him under the moonlight. He imagined the silence that might follow, the puzzled glances, the inevitable laughter. The thought twisted inside him, and he turned away before the fantasy could take root. He was not ready. Not yet. Back in his room, he sat with his clarinet and the little wooden figure. The music that rose from him that night was tinged with both yearning and restraint, as though he were reaching toward a door but could not yet bring himself to open it. He played until his hands ached, until the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of what he had left unsaid. And when he finally stopped, the silence felt alive, waiting. He could not escape the sense that his life was moving toward something, a turning point, a choice he would one day have to make. For now he clung to his routines, his small acts of creation, his secret conversations with the sea. But deep within him a current was gathering, preparing to carry him somewhere he could not yet see. The boy who once believed himself unnoticed was beginning to awaken to a truth larger than solitude, though he could not yet name it. The sea was teaching him patience. The world, in its quiet way, was preparing him for the moment when he would no longer be able to hide. The mornings began to carry a different hue. Though nothing outward had changed, Squidward still awoke to the muted light filtering through the water, still prepared his day in the same careful sequence, still moved through the rhythm of his routine. Yet within him something stirred, an awareness, faint but insistent, like the distant hum of a melody he could not ignore. It was as though his nights by the sea had left a mark on him, and that mark followed him into daylight. He noticed details more keenly, the slow drift of bubbles rising from the coral beds, the way the current tugged at kelp fronds, the faint echo of shells knocking together in the tide. These small sounds and movements reminded him of music, as though the world itself was an instrument waiting to be played. But still, he kept his secret hidden. The carved figure sat by his clarinet, a companion only he knew. The melodies he had discovered belonged to the quiet hours when no one else was near. By day, he was careful to guard them, unsure what would happen if anyone else were to hear. He had grown accustomed to the safety of solitude, the comfort of knowing his heart was safe from judgment when only the waves listened. Yet beneath that safety lay a restlessness, a yearning to be understood. It was not fame he longed for, nor applause. It was simply the recognition that what he carried inside mattered, that it could touch another soul. One afternoon, while wandering through the market streets, he caught sight of a familiar face, one of the elders who often passed by his home. The man was seated on a low stone wall, playing a weathered flute. The notes were uneven, the breath of someone out of practice, but there was sincerity in them, a kind of trembling honesty that made Squidward pause. People passed without stopping, too caught in their errands to notice, yet Squidward lingered. He realized in that moment how fragile and beautiful it was to play without expectation, without audience, only because the music insisted on being released. The elder noticed him watching, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement that art need not always be seen to be real. Squidward lowered his gaze and moved on, but the image stayed with him. That night, as he lifted his clarinet to his lips, the elder's music echoed in his mind. It made his own notes feel less lonely, as though somewhere nearby another voice was also filling the darkness. He played with a gentler touch, weaving his sound like a thread through the silence, not forcing it, only letting it drift. The sea answered as it always did, not in words, not in any visible sign, but in the deep assurance that he was not alone. The weeks that followed unfolded quietly, each night adding another layer to his secret practice. Yet, with each new melody came a stronger pull, urging him to share what he had found. He resisted at first, telling himself it was enough to play for the sea, enough to carve figures that never left his shelf. But the yearning would not let him rest. He began to imagine how it might feel for someone, just one person, to listen without laughter, to hear the heart hidden in his sound. He thought of the elder's trembling flute, of how it had moved him despite its flaws, and he wondered if his own music could ever do the same. There were moments when he nearly gave in to the urge. Once he almost carried his clarinet to a small gathering, telling himself he might join in when the others began to play. But as the crowd grew loud with chatter and jokes, fear closed around him, and he slipped away before anyone noticed. Another time, he imagined playing for a neighbor who sometimes hummed as she worked, her voice gentle and kind. He pictured her listening, perhaps even smiling. But when he raised the idea in his mind, the thought of her laughter, real or imagined, stopped him cold. So instead, he returned to the shore, the only place where courage did not fail him. The tide had become his confidant, the moon his companion, the stars above a quiet chorus. Each note he offered was met with silence, and in that silence, acceptance. He found peace in that exchange, yet also a growing sense that this stage, vast as it was, might not be enough forever. He was beginning to understand that music was meant to be shared, that its true power lay not only in expression, but in connection. One evening, after playing until his breath grew shallow, he lowered the clarinet and looked out across the endless dark of the sea. For the first time he spoke aloud. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. If there is something listening, if there is meaning in these songs, tell me. Show me where they are meant to go. His words were carried off by the tide, swallowed into the vastness, but in his chest a quiet answer stirred, not in language, but in the certainty that one day the path would reveal itself. That night, when he returned to his room, he looked at the wooden figure on his desk. Its hollow eyes seemed to gaze back at him as though waiting. He reached out and touched it gently, a vow forming in his heart. One day, he would no longer play only for himself. One day he would let the world hear, and though that day was not yet upon him, he carried the promise within, like a lantern unlit but ready, waiting for the right hands to strike the spark. The turning of the tides had begun to shape Squidward in ways he barely noticed. Each day the rhythm of his life remained largely unchanged, but his perception had deepened. Where once he had merely observed the world, he now felt it, the weight of the sunlight on coral, the gentle pull of water around his feet, the subtle harmony hidden in the noises of a marketplace. These details were no longer distractions. They were threads, connecting him to a world he had once believed indifferent. He realized slowly that the quiet he cherished did not isolate him. It sharpened his awareness, revealing layers of life others overlooked. It was during one of these quiet mornings that he discovered the joy of improvisation. He had long practiced scales and melodies by rote, each note careful, each pause deliberate. But one morning, as the tide shimmered with silver, he allowed himself to wander. He lifted his clarinet and let his fingers move freely, following impulses instead of rules. The notes tumbled out like bubbles, some high and delicate, some low and grounding. For the first time, he did not notice the mistakes, the uneven breaths, or the cracked notes. Instead, he heard the music as a conversation, a dialogue between him, the ocean, and the morning light. In that freedom, he felt a thrill he had never experienced. Music as living, breathing, unpredictable. This new approach began to spill into other aspects of his life. His sketches, once carefully measured and neat, became bolder, more abstract. He drew spirals that seemed to stretch beyond the paper, shapes that suggested motion and emotion rather than literal forms. Even the carved figure on his desk began to transform under his hands, evolving from a static likeness to something more expressive, more alive. Each new curve, each new detail felt like a breath of life, as though the figure itself were learning to speak the language of his imagination. Despite this growth, Squidward's world outside remained challenging. His peers still did not understand him, still whispered and laughed in ways that sometimes pierced his confidence. At school, he tried to remain invisible, walking the line between participation and withdrawal. Yet even in the midst of this social friction, he found small, unexpected moments of connection. A teacher's rare glance of acknowledgement, a classmate's quiet compliment on a drawing left on the desk. These fleeting gestures, though subtle, carried the weight of validation he had long been denied. They reminded him that small ripples could travel far, even if the world seemed indifferent at first glance. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Squidward returned to the shore with a clarity he had not felt before. He settled on a smooth rock, clarinet in hand, and began to play. This time, he did not merely offer his music to the night. He played as if speaking to something unseen, a presence that had followed him through years of quiet growth. Each note carried the weight of his longing, his small triumphs, his losses, and his hopes. He imagined the waves rising to meet him, imagined the currents carrying his sound across distances he could not measure. And when he paused, he felt the same comforting silence that had accompanied him in the past, the assurance that he was not unheard, not invisible. The seasons continued to change, and with them came the subtle realization that his solitude was no longer merely a shield, it was also a teacher. It had honed his perception, sharpened his empathy, and deepened his ability to connect with the world in ways that others might overlook. He began to understand that his difference was not a weakness, but a form of quiet strength. His music and art, once solitary pursuits, had become tools for observation and reflection, allowing him to engage with the world on his own terms. In these reflective hours, Squidward also began to recognize the value of patience. He had once longed for immediate understanding, for applause or acknowledgement. Now he understood that true resonance takes time. Music and creation are not always about the audience that claps or praises. They are about the subtle, enduring impact that reaches hearts in ways that are invisible at first. His notes, his sketches, his carvings, each was a testament to this patient labor of love, a quiet legacy forming slowly beneath the surface. And still, there were moments of yearning. He wondered what it might feel like to share his work openly, to let someone step into the world he had so carefully crafted. But those thoughts did not frighten him as they once had. Instead, they stirred a sense of anticipation. He had learned to wait, to prepare, to allow his own understanding and skill to grow before stepping into the larger world. That night, after the tide had receded and the moon hung low and silver over the water, Squidward placed his clarinet beside the carved figure. He traced a finger along its smooth, evolving curves and whispered softly, "One day, the music will be ready, and so will I." The figure seemed to watch him in silent agreement, a witness to the patient unfolding of his life. He smiled quietly and felt a rare peace. The world might still be unaware, still bustling in its careless way, but he was beginning to see that it was enough to exist, to create, to wait. And in that soft, enduring certainty, Squidward realized something vital. Growth, like music, is not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it is a whisper, a ripple, a note held just long enough for the next to follow. The nights had grown long and quiet, stretching like velvet over the water, and Squidward found himself more often at the edge of the shore, clarinet in hand, tracing melodies that seemed to rise from the very depths of his being. Each note felt like a step into a world he was only beginning to understand, a world where silence was not emptiness, but a canvas, and where the faintest ripple of sound could carry meaning farther than he imagined. He had learned that his music, though fragile and imperfect, had a reach beyond what eyes could see, ears could hear, or minds could grasp. It was in the pauses, the hesitant breaths, the tremor of his fingers, that the truth of his inner life emerged, delicate and unmistakable. The carved figure he had shaped years ago sat nearby, weathered slightly by time and sunlight, its hollow eyes catching moonlight in ways that made it seem almost alive. Squidward often spoke to it quietly, though never aloud to anyone else. "I wonder," he would murmur, "if they could ever hear it the way I do." And though the figure did not answer, he felt its presence like a steady heartbeat beside his own. It had become a silent companion, a witness to his growth and his fears, and, in its stillness, he found the courage to reach further into the music he carried. School and the world outside continued, predictable and unyielding, but Squidward had grown less sensitive to their indifference. He no longer flinched when peers whispered, or when teachers dismissed his ambitions with polite smiles. Those things still stung, yes, but he had found something deeper to rely on, the patience that comes from practicing a single note until it carries weight, the quiet persistence of carving each detail into wood, the understanding that beauty often goes unnoticed, but that does not make it any less real. He had begun to see the world as a place layered in subtleties, a place where small acts of observation, kindness, and creation mattered more than applause or recognition. One evening, as he played near the tide, a soft ripple reached his feet, carrying a faint shimmer in the moonlight. It was not unusual for him to imagine the ocean responding to his music, yet tonight felt different. He lowered the clarinet slightly and watched as a cluster of small sea creatures, tiny fish, luminous in the dim light, swirled in rhythm to his melody. Their movements were subtle, but synchronized in a way that felt intentional, as if the music had found them and they, in turn, had acknowledged it. Squidward's chest lifted with a quiet astonishment. He had always known the sea listened, but the sense of reciprocal awareness, even from the smallest forms of life, filled him with a tender warmth he had seldom experienced. It was in this growing recognition of connection, even in the quietest forms, that Squidward began to understand something essential. That the act of creating, whether through music, art or thought, was itself a bridge to the world. It was not about being seen by everyone, but about offering something honest, something alive, into the space between oneself and others. And sometimes the acknowledgement did not come from peers or crowds, but from the universe itself, the shifting tides, the moonlight, the gentle nod of creatures too small to name. As he returned home that night, the familiar weight of anticipation pressed against him. He thought about the future and the music he had yet to explore, the sketches he had not yet completed, the carvings still waiting for a hand to guide them into shape. Each project was a small challenge, a puzzle, a story in waiting. And though he sometimes feared the impossibility of sharing his inner world, he also felt a burgeoning courage. He had spent years learning to listen to the sea, to his own hands, to the subtle patterns of life. Now he felt he was beginning to understand how to speak. That night, as the house settled into the quiet hum of sleep, Squidward lifted his clarinet once more. The notes poured out in gentle waves, rising and falling like the tides themselves. They were not perfect. Some faltered, some trailed into silence. Yet they were honest, alive with the echoes of years spent observing, waiting, and listening. And in that honesty, he found an unexpected satisfaction, a quiet exhale that traveled through his chest and into the night. He paused, letting the final note linger in the air, and for the first time, he imagined someone, anyone, hearing it without judgment. Perhaps it would be a neighbor, perhaps a passerby, perhaps no one at all. It did not matter. What mattered was that the music existed and that it carried with it the small, unwavering truth of who he had become, someone patient, observant, gentle, and unafraid to exist fully within the spaces others might overlook. Before he set the clarinet aside, Squidward looked at the carved figure on his desk. Its eyes seemed to catch the moonlight again, almost knowingly. "We are ready," he whispered softly, as though promising the figure and himself that the music and the world would meet eventually. And in that quiet promise, a sense of calm settled over him, warm and enduring, like a wave gently folding back into the shore. The early hours of morning had begun to take on a different quality for Squidward. He rose before the light fully touched the water, allowing the soft grey of dawn to settle across the sand and coral. The tide whispered against the shore, each wave a gentle rhythm that seemed to mirror the pulses of his own heart. In these hours, the world felt suspended between night and day, quiet enough for thoughts to drift freely, yet alive enough to carry a subtle energy. It was during these moments that he found himself reaching for his clarinet more than ever, letting the soft, trembling notes fill the space between himself and the waking world. The clarinet had grown familiar, as if it had been a part of him all along. Its wood was worn smooth, its keys responding with a gentleness that made each melody feel like an intimate conversation. Squidward no longer played simply to practice or to release his frustrations. He He played because the music seemed to insist on being heard. Each note carried fragments of his life, the solitary evenings by the shore, the hours spent sketching and carving, the small joys and lingering sorrows that marked his days. And as the melody unfolded, he felt a profound sense of connection, not to the world at large, but to something deeper, something patient and enduring. The carved figure on his desk had become more than a silent companion. It had become a symbol of the life he had built in quiet persistence. Squidward often imagined it moving subtly when he wasn't looking, nodding along to the music, or shifting its gaze toward some hidden rhythm only it could perceive. It reminded him that even small creations, forms made from wood, from sketches, from notes, held a life of their own, separate from the judgments or dismissals of others, and in that truth he found both solace and encouragement. School and the social world outside remained largely unchanged, but Squidward had shifted within. He no longer flinched as sharply at laughter or whispers. He had discovered that his own awareness, the careful listening, the attention to subtlety, the devotion to creation, was a kind of quiet armor. It did not make him invulnerable to disappointment, but it offered perspective, a recognition that the value of his actions was not dictated by others' approval. His music, his art, his observations, they mattered because they were authentic, and authenticity carried a weight that neither ridicule nor indifference could diminish. One afternoon, as Squidward wandered near the tide pools, he encountered an unexpected presence. A small group of children had gathered, curious about the patterns of light and movement among the shallow waters. Most of them were noisy and impatient, but one child lingered quietly, watching the way Squidward traced designs in the sand. Their eyes met briefly, and the child gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the care with which Squidward approached even the smallest details. It was a minor gesture, fleeting and almost imperceptible, but it left a gentle warmth in his chest. In that moment he recognized a truth he had long suspected. Sometimes connection comes not in loud affirmations, but in the quiet recognition of shared attention and respect. That evening, Squidward returned to his room, carrying a faint sense of purpose that had begun to bloom inside him. He set his clarinet beside the carved figure and took a moment to consider the melody he wanted to explore. Unlike before, he did not hesitate, did not wonder if it would falter or be unnoticed. He played as though the notes themselves were an extension of his breath, releasing the long-held tension of unspoken thought. The music rose and fell, dipping into silences, brushing against the edges of memory, and forming arcs that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of his room. For the first time, he felt as if the melody had a trajectory beyond practice, a small, tentative path toward sharing, toward reaching beyond himself. As he played, he thought of the ocean and the moments of acknowledgement it had offered him, and he felt a quiet thrill. He realized that he had been cultivating patience, awareness, and sensitivity not for an audience, but for himself. And yet in doing so, he had prepared himself to be heard when the time came. His music was no longer only a private dialogue with the sea. It had begun to acquire a resonance that might one day extend further, touching hearts he could not yet imagine. Later, when he finally set the clarinet down and looked at the carved figure, he traced a finger along its curves, smiling softly. "We are ready," he whispered, a promise to himself as much as to the silent witness before him. The figure seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, as though acknowledging the vow. Squidward felt a rare serenity settle into his bones, a deep exhale that carried away the lingering doubts of past years. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt a subtle confidence that he could navigate it, one note, one sketch, one patient step at a time. And so he lay back that night, listening to the faint rhythm of the waves against the shore, a quiet reassurance filling the spaces of his mind. He understood finally that growth is not a sudden revelation, but a series of gentle awakenings. And tonight, As always, the music was his guide, leading him forward into the next stage of the journey, patiently, without rush, with the quiet promise of discovery still waiting beyond the horizon. The dawn arrived soft and slow, spilling pale gold across the water in thin, trembling beams that seemed almost shy in their approach. Squidward awoke with the usual rhythm in his chest, a gentle anticipation that had become as familiar as the tide itself. He dressed quietly, careful not to disturb the house's stillness, and carried his clarinet to the shore, where the sea welcomed him with the same unhurried patience it always had. Today, though, something felt different, not urgent or startling, but a subtle shift, like the first tremor of wind before a storm that never fully comes. As he settled on a smooth rock and raised the clarinet to his lips, he noticed the way the light caught the edges of the tide pools, glinting like tiny lanterns beneath the water's surface. The reflections seemed to dance with the notes he played, each melody a ripple, each pause a small space for the sea to answer. He no longer sought perfection. He had learned that the imperfections, the cracks and hesitations, were what gave his music depth. They spoke of him, of the years spent observing, waiting, and quietly shaping himself. The notes were a language, and through them he could converse with a world that often seemed indifferent, yet always attentive when he truly listened. The carved figure on his desk had begun to take on an almost spiritual significance. Squidward often imagined it watching him play, silently encouraging, silently witnessing. Tonight, as the melody wove into the rhythmic pulse of the waves, he could almost feel the figure leaning toward him, as though its hollow eyes absorbed every quiver of sound. There was comfort in this imagined companionship, a reminder that even when the world was inattentive or unkind, someone was always observing, always acknowledging his presence. After finishing a long sequence of notes that tapered into silence, Squidward allowed himself to sit quietly, gazing at the horizon where the sky met the water. It struck him that so much of life had been a waiting game, waiting for understanding, waiting for connection, waiting for the courage to step beyond the boundaries he had set for himself. And yet he realized that waiting was not wasted time. It had been formative, patient, shaping him in subtle ways that would reveal themselves only when the moment was right. The melody of his life was built on these pauses as much as on the notes themselves. Later, as he wandered back through the small streets toward his home, he encountered a brief, unexpected moment of human connection. A passerby, older, with a gentle, curious gaze, paused to watch him balancing a basket of small sketches. The person's eyes lingered just long enough to convey recognition, a small, wordless acknowledgement of the care and intent in his work. No words were exchanged, and the gesture was brief, yet Squidward felt it deeply. It was a reminder that even fleeting acknowledgement could leave a lasting impression. Often it was the smallest acts that carried the greatest weight, and sometimes simply being seen, truly seen, was enough to strengthen the heart. Back in his room, he laid the sketches beside the carved figure, allowing a quiet smile to tug at his lips. The figure seemed to catch the moonlight that spilled through the window, as if to mirror his quiet contentment. Squidward realized that these small creations, each sketch, each carved detail, each carefully played note, were not merely exercises in solitude, but bridges toward connection. They contained the weight of his emotions, his careful attention, his gentle longing, and in some way they already reached beyond the walls of his room, touching a world he had not yet met. Night fell with a calm certainty. The stars reflected in the rippling water like tiny pinpricks of recognition. Squidward returned to the shore one last time before sleep, clarinet in hand, letting his melody drift slowly across the tide. Each note carried the rhythm of patience, the weight of longing, and the soft echo of hope. He did not imagine applause, nor did he play for anyone's understanding. He played for the moment itself, for the small, enduring connection between himself, the sea, and the world he quietly observed. By the time he returned home, the air was thick with the hush of night, and he felt a rare serenity settling into his chest. Growth, he realized, was not sudden or dramatic. It was composed of these quiet awakenings, these subtle recognitions of beauty and presence. Even when the world seemed unaware, even when laughter and indifference brushed past him, he had cultivated patience, artistry, and the capacity to feel deeply. And that, he understood, was enough. As he lay down to rest, Squidward glanced at the carved figure once more, tracing its curves with the gentlest of touches. "One day," he whispered softly, "the music will find its path." And in that whisper, carried in the stillness of the room and the rhythm of his breath, there was promise. The tides, the night, the silent figure, they would all witness his journey. And so he drifted into sleep with a quiet exhale, the gentle assurance that his patience and persistence were forming a bridge to the world he had yet to meet. The morning arrived softly, as though the world itself were reluctant to stir. Squidward woke to the gentle light filtering through his window, pale and quiet, and for a moment he lingered in bed, listening to the distant rhythm of the waves. Each day felt like a continuation of the last, yet he sensed a subtle unfolding beneath the surface, a slow growth, barely perceptible. That seemed to stretch his understanding of himself and the world around him. The air smelled faintly of salt and kelp, familiar and grounding, reminding him that even in solitude, he was not entirely alone. He rose and dressed carefully, moving with the quiet deliberation that had become second nature. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, polished and ready. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, the cool metal keys beneath his fingers. Today, he thought, he would let the melody find him rather than forcing it. He had learned, over many months, that music was not a tool to shape the world, but a reflection of what already lived inside him. And sometimes, he realized, the truest melodies were born in moments of stillness rather than effort. Walking toward the shore, he noticed small details he had once overlooked. A school of tiny fish darting beneath the surface, catching the light like fleeting sparks. A cluster of shells that had shifted overnight, forming a pattern he might have once ignored. The faint hum of the wind through nearby kelp fronds carrying a resonance that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. These details, once trivial, now felt alive, as though they had been waiting for him to see them. He paused often, letting his gaze linger, and found that each observation deepened his connection to the world around him. When he finally settled on his usual rock, clarinet in hand, the first notes emerged slowly, almost hesitantly. But as he continued, the melody took shape, weaving together fragments of his recent observations, the shimmer of light on water, the gentle sway of seaweed, the silent acknowledgement of life in all its small forms. The music was softer than usual, yet it carried a quiet insistence, as if demanding to be heard, even without an audience. He played for the rhythm of existence itself, for the small pulses and patterns that went unnoticed by most, and in doing so, he felt an expanding sense of presence after playing for some time. Squidward lowered the clarinet and allowed the silence to wash over him. The sea, as always, seemed to respond, not with sound, but with a subtle shift in the water's movement, the gentle push of tide against sand, the quiet glimmer of moonlight on ripples. He realized that this responsiveness, even if intangible, was enough. Connection did not always require eyes or ears. It could exist in acknowledgement itself, in the patient witness of the world. And in that realization, he found both relief and joy. Returning home, Squidward found himself thinking about the carved figure still sitting steadfastly on his desk. It had become more than a silent companion. It was a mirror for his own patience and persistence. Each curve, each hollow eye seemed to hold the memory of his growth, the years of quiet observation and practice. He traced a finger along its edges, and for the first time he felt that the figure was not merely an object, but a keeper of his evolving story. A reminder that even the smallest acts of creation held weight and significance. In the afternoon, a brief encounter added another subtle layer to his awareness. A young neighbor, carrying a basket of seashells, stopped near his window, observing a sketch he had left by the sill. The child's gaze lingered, curious but gentle, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. No words were exchanged, yet Squidward felt a surge of warmth. Recognition, even silent, was profound. It confirmed that his small offerings to music, to art, to observation, could reach beyond the confines of his room and touch the lives of others in ways he had not yet imagined. That evening, Squidward returned to the shore once more, letting the clarinet's voice rise against the soft backdrop of waves. The melody was shaped by months of practice and quiet reflection, yet it also carried a new element: openness. He imagined, not loudly but gently, that perhaps someday someone would hear it and feel its intention. Not the skill behind the notes, but the emotion, the care, the patience embedded within them. He allowed himself to envision that distant resonance, knowing that it need not arrive immediately to exist. As he played, the night deepened, and the stars reflected on the water like scattered lanterns. He felt the subtle assurance that he was moving in the right direction, that the small steps of patience, observation, and creation were leading him towards something meaningful, even if he could not yet define it. For the first time in a long while, Squidward felt not only readiness but quiet anticipation, a trust in the unfolding of his own journey. Finally, as the tide receded and the moon cast a silver glow across the sand, he set the clarinet beside the carved figure and whispered softly, "We are still learning. We are still waiting. And that is enough." The figure seemed to acknowledge him in its silent, unwavering way, and Squidward felt a rare serenity settle in his chest. The world was vast, mysterious, and patient, and he was a part of it, growing, observing, creating, and moving quietly forward. The early hours of night had a hush that felt like a soft exhale, a gentle settling over the world that invited reflection. Squidward found himself awake later than usual, drawn to the window by the silvered light of the moon glinting on the distant ripples of the tide. It was not urgency that moved him, but a quiet insistence, a gentle tug in his chest that reminded him of the patterns he had begun to notice, the rhythm of the water, the slow sway of kelp, the subtle shifts in shadows along the sand. Life, he realized, had a melody of its own, and his music was simply learning to listen and respond. He dressed slowly, the familiar ritual grounding him. The clarinet rested in his hands like an extension of his own breath. Squidward had learned to trust it, not as a tool for recognition or performance, but as a medium to express what otherwise could not find words. Each note had become a conversation between himself, the tides, and the quiet universe surrounding him. When he lifted the instrument to his lips, the first sounds were tentative, almost fragile, yet carried within them the weight of countless hours of practice and reflection. Each tremor in his fingers, each faltering breath was not a flaw but an honesty, a declaration of presence and attention. He moved to the shore, the soft sand cool beneath his feet. The carved figure on his desk, tucked safely in his bag, accompanied him in spirit. Its hollow eyes seemed to echo the patience he had cultivated, a silent reminder of the persistence required to create, to notice, to grow. As he played, the notes stretched outward, curling around the night air, and brushing against the edge of awareness. The music no longer sought to impress, it simply existed, a ripple that traveled outward, touching spaces invisible to him, yet real all the same. Squidward's mind drifted as he played, recalling the moments that had shaped him most. The long nights spent carving and sketching, the cautious observation of small patterns, the hesitant interactions with neighbors and strangers, all had taught him patience, empathy, and the subtle power of persistence. It struck him that growth was rarely dramatic or immediate. It accumulated quietly, like the slow rise of the tide, imperceptible in its early stages but transformative over time. He understood now that the strength he had been cultivating was not to be measured by accolades or applause, but by the depth of connection he could sustain, both with himself and the world around him. After a long stretch of music, he paused to let silence settle. The waves responded in kind, brushing the shore in gentle, measured pulses. The harmony between his notes and the natural rhythm of the tide felt like a conversation in which neither participant sought to dominate. He had discovered that true resonance, whether in music, art, or life, was not about being loud or noticed, but about attuning oneself to the subtle currents already present. This quiet realization filled him with a gentle awe, a sense of belonging that had eluded him for years. Later, as he wandered back through the empty streets toward home, Squidward encountered a small, unplanned gesture of recognition. A stray dog, thin and scruffy, paused to observe him for a moment, its head tilted curiously. There was no words, no expectation, only attention and acknowledgement. It padded alongside him for a short distance before wandering away, leaving him with an unexpected warmth in his chest. Sometimes he realized connection did not need to be articulated. It was enough that life, whatever form it took, noticed, and that he noticed in return. Returning home, he laid the clarinet down carefully and reached for the carved figure, tracing its curves with deliberate tenderness. "We are learning," he whispered softly, "even in the quiet, even when the world seems unaware." The figure, though motionless, seemed to reflect the persistence of his own growth, a silent testament to the patience that had brought him here. Squidward thought about the days ahead, the melodies yet unplayed, the sketches yet drawn, the carvings yet shaped. Each small act of creation, each attentive observation, was a brick in the bridge he was quietly building toward a world that had yet to hear him fully. He understood that the process itself, the careful attention, the patience, the willingness to be vulnerable, was as significant as the outcome. In the act of creating, he had already begun to shape a quiet legacy. Finally, he lay down to rest, the night still around him, the gentle pulse of the tide resonating in his chest. He allowed himself to exhale, fully and deeply, feeling the subtle assurance that his efforts were not in vain. Growth, he realized, was a slow unfolding, a melody played note by note, carried over time into spaces both seen and unseen. And with that understanding, Squidward drifted into sleep, the calm certainty of continued discovery cradling him gently, as though the world itself whispered, "You are seen. You are enough." The morning arrived with a delicate hush, the kind of quiet that carried the soft promise of discovery. Squidward awoke to the faint shimmer of light filtering through his window, spreading pale reflections across the floor. He lingered for a moment, listening to the rhythmic lap of the waves against the shore. Each note of the tide seemed to speak to him, a subtle dialogue that he had grown accustomed to over the years. The world outside moved with its usual indifference, yet, in that stillness, he felt a deep sense of resonance, a reassurance that the quiet work of patience and observation was not wasted. He dressed deliberately, allowing each movement to anchor him to the present. The clarinet rested in its usual place, worn and familiar, its keys cool beneath his fingers. Squidward lifted it carefully, sensing that today, more than any other day, he needed to allow the music to flow without restraint. The notes would carry fragments of the past, the patience of practice, and the quiet hope of connection. Each breath, each fingered key was a deliberate act of trust. Trust in the melody, trust in himself, trust in the invisible currents that always seemed to guide him. As he moved toward the shore, he noticed the subtle shifts that had become almost sacred in their constancy. The flicker of sunlight through moving kelp, the tiny movements of sand crabs beneath the water, the distant shimmer of a passing school of fish. He paused often, not to admire, but to observe and absorb. These details, once background noise, now spoke to him in a language older than words. He realized that the world's subtleties were a kind of rhythm, a pulse that mirrored the music he carried within. And in listening carefully, he had begun to feel not just a connection to life, but a responsibility to honor it. Settling onto a familiar rock at the water's edge, Squidward lifted the clarinet and let the first notes emerge. They were soft, hesitant, yet deliberate, curling around the tide and into the night. The melody seemed to absorb the sounds of the shore, the whisper of the water, the distant cries of seabirds, the occasional rustle of unseen creatures beneath the sand. Squidward did not seek perfection. He sought truth in the resonance, the fragile honesty that existed in every pause, every uneven breath. The music was not for anyone's ears but his own, and yet he imagined it reaching farther, brushing against distant hearts like a gentle tide. His mind wandered as he played, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. The long hours of solitary practice, the careful carving and sketching, the moments of quiet observation, they had not been wasted. Each note played now carried the weight of years spent learning to listen, to notice, and to trust. He understood that true connection did not always require acknowledgement from others. It could exist quietly in the simple act of paying attention, of offering what one had to the universe. After a while, he let the clarinet rest and allowed the silence to settle over him. The waves answered in kind, brushing the shore with a measured rhythm that seemed almost conversational. He felt a rare clarity. Growth, patience, and presence were themselves a kind of music, a subtle harmony that extended beyond what could be immediately seen or heard. Even in solitude, he was part of a dialogue larger than himself, one that encompassed time, memory, and the slow unfolding of life. Later, walking back through the quiet streets, Squidward noticed a neighbor tending to a small garden. Their gaze met briefly, curious and gentle, and though no words were exchanged, the moment lingered like a soft chord in the air. Recognition, fleeting and wordless, could carry as much significance as overt praise. It reminded him that the ripple of small acts, attention, kindness, presence, could reach farther than expected, touching lives in subtle, enduring ways. Back in his room, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure, the two now inseparable companions in his ongoing exploration of sound and solitude. He traced a finger along the figure's curves and whispered softly, "We continue, quietly, patiently, and that is enough." The figure seemed to hold that promise in its hollow eyes, a silent witness to the steady unfolding of his journey. Squidward felt the weight of years lift slightly, replaced by a serene understanding. Progress was measured not in applause or recognition, but in the consistency of attention, the willingness to create, and the courage to be present. As night fell, he returned to the shore one last time, allowing the clarinet to carry his thoughts into the darkened tide. Each note was deliberate, soft, and full of intention, a reflection of months spent listening, learning, and growing. The stars above mirrored the water below, scattered points of light that seemed to acknowledge his quiet persistence. He felt a subtle exhale settle through his chest, the calm satisfaction of a moment fully lived, and as he finally returned home, Squidward laid down with a gentle smile, the quiet promise of discovery and patience cradling him. He knew that tomorrow would bring more notes, more observations, more subtle awakenings. The journey was ongoing, but the rhythm of it, the slow, deliberate unfolding, was enough to carry him forward, softly, steadily, into the next chapter of life. The morning arrived with a soft sigh, the kind that felt like the world exhaling gently before beginning its day. Squidward woke slowly, the familiar rhythm of the tide calling him toward the shore. He lingered for a moment by his window, watching pale streaks of sunlight stretch across the sand and glint off the gentle waves. The light seemed to move with a quiet awareness, brushing the surface in slow, deliberate strokes. In those moments, he felt the same subtle rhythm he had been learning to recognize in music, in sketches, in the carved figure that had become his steadfast companion. Life itself, he realized, carried patterns that could be observed, understood, and echoed if one listened carefully enough. He dressed with measured care, mindful of the way small gestures grounded him to the present. The clarinet rested lightly in his hands, familiar and comforting, its keys responding with a warmth that made each note feel like a conversation with the morning. Today, he thought, he would allow the music to find its own path, letting the tide of melody carry him rather than trying to steer it. In the past, he had strived for precision, for perfection, for a sense of control. But he now understood that true resonance came from surrendering to the flow, letting the notes emerge organically, and trusting in their quiet persistence. Walking along the familiar stretch of shore, Squidward noticed the details that had once gone unnoticed. The shifting patterns of sand beneath his feet, the delicate dance of seaweed swaying in the shallow water, the faint glimmer of sunlight reflected in the scales of a passing fish. Each movement, each reflection, felt alive with intention, a gentle echo of the patience he had cultivated over the years. He paused often, letting these small observations settle into him, absorbing their rhythm and weaving it into the music he would soon play. It was not just the act of noticing that mattered, but the willingness to remain open to subtlety, to be present, and to trust in the value of even the quietest moments. When he finally reached his usual rock at the water's edge, Squidward lifted the clarinet to his lips and let the first notes flow freely. The melody was soft, tender, and deliberate, curling around the natural rhythm of the tide. Each note carried the weight of his careful observations, the shimmer of light on water, the slow sway of the kelp, the silent, wordless acknowledgement of life moving quietly beside him. He played not for recognition, not for praise, but for the dialogue between himself and the world, a conversation of attention, patience, and subtle understanding. In every falter, every hesitation, there was honesty. In every pause, a space for reflection. As the morning deepened, Squidward allowed his mind to wander through the memories that had shaped him. He thought of the long hours spent practicing scales and melodies, the sketches and carvings born from quiet observation, and the moments of recognition that had arrived fleetingly, yet left lasting warmth. He realized that growth, like the tides, was cumulative, slow, imperceptible in the moment, yet transformative over time. Patience had become his ally, and the quiet attention he offered the world had become his strength. In the delicate balance between effort and surrender, he had begun to understand the subtle power of presence. Later, returning through the quiet streets, he encountered a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, curious but gentle, acknowledging not the act itself, but the care with which it was done. Squidward felt a warmth rise in his chest. Recognition, even unspoken, carried weight. Small gestures and quiet attentiveness could reach farther than words, a lesson he had come to understand and cherish. Sometimes the most meaningful connections were those that required no dialogue, only observation and empathy. Back in his room, he laid the clarinet beside the carved figure. The familiar curves and hollow eyes seemed to reflect the day's quiet revelations, a mirror of his patient persistence and growing understanding. He traced a finger along its edges and whispered, "We continue softly, deliberately, and that is enough." The figure, silent yet steadfast, felt like a partner in the slow unfolding of his journey, a witness to his learning, his music, and the subtle growth that often went unnoticed by others. As night settled, Squidward returned to the shore one last time, letting the clarinet's voice rise against the soft backdrop of waves. Each note was deliberate and filled with intention, shaped by months of patient observation, reflection, and quiet practice. The stars mirrored the water below, scattered points of light that seemed to acknowledge the quiet persistence of his journey. He felt a deep exhale settle into his chest, the satisfaction of a day lived fully, intentionally, and with attention. And as he finally returned home, Squidward lay down with a gentle smile, the quiet rhythm of growth and discovery cradling him. The journey was ongoing, but the melody of patience, observation, and creation was enough to carry him forward, softly and steadily, into the next chapter of his life. The morning broke slowly, as if the world itself was stretching awake, taking its time to gather warmth and light. Squidward stirred beneath the soft sheets, feeling the familiar pull of the tide in his chest, a rhythm that had become inseparable from his own heartbeat. The sea outside whispered gently, its waves brushing against the shore with a quiet insistence, neither urgent nor loud, but persistent enough to call him forward. Rising, he allowed himself a moment to linger by the window, letting the pale light and the faint scent of salt fill his senses. There was a calm patience in the way the day unfolded, a gentle reminder that growth, his growth, was as subtle as it was enduring. Dressing slowly, he gathered his clarinet, the worn wood cool beneath his fingers, each key familiar like the contours of his own thoughts. Today he decided he would play not to perfect a melody, but to observe it, to feel it unfold in tandem with the world. Music, he had come to understand, was not only expression, but reflection, an intimate dialogue with the world's smallest details, with the patience of time, with the subtle currents of life itself. Each note was a step into presence, a deliberate acknowledgement of the slow, steady rhythm of existence. The shore welcomed him, stretching in familiar, uneven lines of sand and tide. Squidward noticed the small wonders he had come to cherish, a cluster of shells arranged by the waves, a fish darting with iridescent scales in the shallow water, the faint shimmer of moonlight still lingering in pockets where the night had yet to fully yield. He paused often, letting these quiet movements imprint themselves upon his awareness. These details, he realized, were more than background. They were a rhythm, a pulse he could mirror in music, capturing their essence in sound. He settled on his usual rock, raised the clarinet, and let the first notes flow. They were soft, tentative at first, brushing the edges of silence, but gradually gaining confidence, forming arcs of sound that intertwined with the waves' gentle rhythm. There was no need for perfection. The beauty lay in the honesty of each note, in the delicate resonance that carried fragments of his observations, his patience, and the slow accumulation of years spent listening and learning. Every falter, every hesitation became a space for reflection, an invitation for the world to respond in kind. As he played, Squidward's thoughts drifted naturally toward the small connections he had been nurturing. The carved figure on his desk, for instance, had become more than an object. It was a companion in the quiet work of self-discovery, a reminder of persistence, patience, and the subtle joy of creation. Its hollow eyes seemed almost to observe his music with understanding, bearing witness to his growth without judgment. The realization that creation itself could be a form of companionship filled him with a tender warmth, a reassurance that solitude did not mean isolation. Later, he wandered back through the quiet streets toward home, noticing a small, fleeting act of recognition, a neighbor adjusting a flower in a garden, their gaze lingering just long enough to acknowledge his presence. Squidward felt the faint, unexpected satisfaction of being noticed, not for grandeur or performance, but for attentive observation and care. These tiny, wordless exchanges reinforced a truth he had come to hold. Connection did not require ceremony or declaration. Often it arrived subtly, in quiet acknowledgement, in shared attention, in the simple act of being seen and seeing in return. Back in his room, he set the clarinet beside the carved figure, tracing a finger along its curves and whispering softly, "We continue, slowly, carefully, and that is enough." There was a rhythm in this persistence, a silent recognition that the small, consistent acts of creation, observation, and reflection were accumulating into something meaningful, something enduring. Squidward understood that life's melody unfolded gradually, note by note, and that the patience he cultivated now would carry him far beyond the horizon of immediate understanding. As the day gave way to night, he returned once more to the shore. The stars scattered above, mirrored in the gentle ripples of the water, seemed to nod in quiet acknowledgement of his dedication. He allowed the clarinet to rise in a soft crescendo, each note deliberate, each pause intentional, weaving the day's observations and quiet revelations into a melody of presence and reflection. The tides seemed to respond, brushing the sand with a rhythm that echoed his own heartbeat, affirming the resonance of small, patient acts. Finally, Squidward returned home, carrying with him the satisfaction of a day fully lived, attended to, and reflected upon. Laying down, he felt a gentle calm settle over him, the quiet assurance that the work of creation, observation, and presence was meaningful even when unseen. The journey was ongoing, but the rhythm of persistence, care, and attentive observation was enough to carry him gently forward, softly, steadily, into the next chapter of life. The morning arrived with a gentle hush, the kind of stillness that seemed almost sacred, as if the world itself paused to listen. Squidward awoke slowly, feeling the quiet tug of the tide in his chest, a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own breath. The soft light filtering through his window cast pale streaks across the sand, and for a moment he lingered, letting the calm settle into him. Today, like so many days before, he understood that progress was not measured by grand gestures or applause, but by the quiet accumulation of observation, patience, and subtle understanding. He dressed with care, each movement deliberate, grounding himself in the familiarity of routine. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure, its smooth keys inviting touch, the wood cool and familiar beneath his fingers. Squidward lifted it and took a deep breath, letting the air carry his intentions into the instrument. Today, he would let the music guide him rather than forcing it into shape. The melodies that emerged would be born of attention, presence, and the slow unfolding of understanding. Each note was an echo of the quiet growth that had been forming within him over months, even years, proof that persistence, patience, and observation could quietly transform a life. Walking toward the shore, he noticed the details that had become central to his days, the faint shimmer of sunlight on the gentle ripples, the slow, swaying dance of kelp, the occasional flash of a fish darting beneath the water's surface. Each movement was a fragment of life's rhythm, subtle yet insistent, and Squidward felt a growing kinship with these small patterns. They were not merely background. They were companions in his quiet journey, reminders that attention and patience could yield a resonance deeper than most would ever recognize. He settled on his usual rock, raising the clarinet to his lips. The first notes emerged softly, brushing against the edges of silence before expanding into fuller arcs of sound. There was no need for perfection. Each hesitation, each tremor in his fingers carried authenticity, a truth that could not be taught or copied. The melody intertwined with the ebbing tide, echoing the rhythm of the waves, and Squidward felt a rare alignment, his music and the world moving in unison, neither forcing the other, neither demanding attention, simply existing together in gentle dialogue. As he played, his thoughts drifted naturally to the small connections he had nurtured over time. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, seemed to observe him with understanding, a steadfast companion through months of quiet growth. Its presence reminded him that creation itself could be a form of witness, that even in solitude one could cultivate companionship through attentive care. Each sketch, each melody, each carved detail had become a bridge between himself and the world, small yet meaningful. The acknowledgement need not be loud or obvious. Sometimes it arrived in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Later, as Squidward wandered through the quiet streets back home, he noticed a fleeting moment of recognition, a neighbor adjusting a small potted plant, their gaze lingering just long enough to acknowledge his presence. The warmth that arose in his chest surprised him. It was a subtle confirmation that even the smallest gestures, the tiniest acknowledgments, held weight. Connection, he realized, was often quiet and unspoken, formed not through grand acts, but through attention, care, and the willingness to notice. Back in his room, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced a finger along its curves, whispering softly, "We continue slowly, patiently, and that is enough." The figure seemed to embody the patience and resilience he had cultivated over time, a silent witness to the quiet accumulation of growth, the small acts that had begun to shape a life worth inhabiting. Squidward understood that life's melody was built note by note, observation by observation, and that in each deliberate act of attention, he was constructing a rhythm that carried him forward. As night descended, he returned once more to the shore, allowing the clarinet to carry his reflections into the stillness of the world. Each note was deliberate, each pause intentional, a meditation on patience, observation, and the subtle joy of small connections. The stars above reflected faintly on the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the quiet persistence of his journey. He allowed himself to exhale fully and deeply, feeling a rare serenity settle into his chest. Finally, Squidward returned home, the gentle assurance of the day's practice and observation carrying him into sleep. Lying down, he traced the familiar contours of the carved figure, whispering once more, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey was ongoing, the melody of patience, attention, and subtle growth steadily unfolding. And with that, he drifted into the night, the quiet rhythm of life and music cradling him gently, carrying him softly toward the next chapter of discovery. The morning arrived with a hush that seemed almost reverent, a delicate pause before the world began to stir. Squidward awoke slowly, the tide's rhythm already pulsing in his chest, familiar and grounding. Pale sunlight filtered through his window, spreading soft gold across the sand outside. For a moment he lingered, letting the quiet settle into him, savoring the gentle promise of another day. He had come to understand that growth was rarely loud or sudden. It emerged in these patient, unnoticed stretches of time, shaped by attention, reflection, and the subtle accumulation of effort. He dressed with care, each movement deliberate, mindful of the ways small rituals anchored him to the present. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, waiting like a patient companion. Squidward lifted it, feeling the coolness of the keys beneath his fingers, the familiar weight pressing gently against his palms. Today, he decided, he would let the music carry him without trying to direct it, allowing each note to arise naturally from the quiet observations and experiences he had gathered. He understood that the most meaningful melodies were those born of honesty, vulnerability, and attentiveness to the world's smallest rhythms. Walking along the shore, Squidward noticed the subtle details that had become central to his practice: the shimmer of sunlight on water, the slow undulation of kelp in the tide, the fleeting flash of fish beneath the surface. Each element moved with a quiet persistence, a rhythm that he mirrored in the melodies flowing from his clarinet. These details were not mere background. They were companions, teachers even, reminding him that attention and patience could yield insight and connection. He paused often, letting these small observations settle within him, absorbing their subtle harmonies and shaping the music he would play. Settling on his usual rock, Squidward raised the clarinet and allowed the first notes to rise. They were soft at first, almost tentative, yet deliberate, weaving into the natural rhythm of the waves. The music carried the weight of careful observation, the glint of sunlight on water, the gentle sway of seaweed, the unspoken acknowledgement of life moving quietly beside him. Each pause, each hesitation, was a deliberate space for reflection, a meditation that transformed the act of playing into a dialogue with the world. He played not for recognition, not for anyone's approval, but for the resonance of presence itself, the quiet assurance that effort, attention, and care carried their own reward. As the melody continued, Squidward's thoughts wandered to the quiet bonds he had nurtured over time. The carved figure on his desk had become more than an object. It was a witness, a companion that mirrored his persistence and patience. Its hollow eyes seemed to reflect the rhythm of his growth, a reminder that even solitary creation could be meaningful. Every sketch, every carving, every note he played formed a bridge between himself and the world, subtle and unassuming, yet imbued with significance. Recognition, he realized, was not necessary for value. The act of attentive creation was valuable in itself. Later, wandering back through the empty streets toward home, Squidward noticed a fleeting gesture of connection, a neighbor adjusting a small flower in the window box, their gaze lingering for just a moment. No words were exchanged, yet the acknowledgement warmed him in a way both unexpected and profound. Small, quiet acts often carried more meaning than loud declarations, and he had come to treasure these understated exchanges. They reminded him that presence, attentiveness, and care, though often invisible, were powerful and enduring. Back in his room, Squidward set the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced a finger along its edges. "And we continue, patiently and softly, and that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to absorb the sentiment, a silent companion in the ongoing cultivation of observation, patience, and creation. He understood that life's melody was constructed note by note, choice by choice, observation by observation. Each small act of care, each attentive moment, contributed to a quiet legacy, one that would endure not through spectacle but through persistence, presence, and subtle connection. As night descended, he returned once more to the shore, letting the clarinet rise in soft arcs that mirrored the tide's rhythm. The stars reflected faintly on the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the steady persistence of his journey. He allowed himself a long, slow exhale, the calm satisfaction of a day lived fully, attended to, and reflected upon. Finally, Squidward returned home, lying down with a gentle serenity. The quiet rhythm of creation, observation, and patient growth carried him softly towards sleep. He traced the carved figure one last time, whispering, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey unfolded gently, steadily, and with quiet assurance, each note, each pause, each attentive moment forming the next step of his continuing story. The morning arrived wrapped in a quiet luminescence, the kind that seemed to linger just long enough for a person to notice without forcing attention. Squidward awoke slowly, the soft pull of the tide in his chest already echoing the rhythm of his own breath. Sunlight filtered through his window in gentle streaks, illuminating the room with a calm, almost meditative glow. For a moment, he remained still, savoring the serenity of the dawn. These small, unhurried moments had become precious to him, reminders that growth and understanding often unfolded imperceptibly, like the slow shaping of a shell by the tide. He dressed with careful intention, letting each movement anchor him in the present. The clarinet waited beside the carved figure, its wood cool and reassuring beneath his fingers. Squidward lifted it and breathed deeply, sensing that today's music would be different, not in its complexity, but in the way it would emerge from attentiveness and presence rather than deliberate effort. Each note would carry the subtle observations he had gathered over the weeks, the flicker of sunlight on the water, the gentle sway of kelp, the quiet awareness of life moving around him. Music, he had learned, was less about performance than reflection, a dialogue with the world. Delicate and intimate, as he made his way toward the shore, he noticed small, almost invisible movements, the soft ripple of sand under the shallow water, a school of tiny fish darting with synchronized grace, the occasional glint of sunlight catching on the crest of a wave. Squidward paused often, letting these observations settle in his mind, forming a quiet narrative that intertwined with the music he would soon play. These details, once overlooked, now felt alive, teaching him patience, attention, and the subtle joy of noticing the world without needing to control it. When he settled on his familiar rock, he lifted the clarinet and allowed the first notes to emerge. They were soft, deliberate, curling around the rhythm of the tide, brushing against the natural cadence of waves. Each note reflected a small observation, a quiet thought, a patient attention to the subtleties of life around him. He played for the resonance itself, not for recognition, not for others' ears, but for the conversation between presence and perception. Every pause, every gentle falter carried honesty, a declaration that imperfection could be as profound as precision. As the melody unfolded, Squidward's thoughts drifted to the bonds he had cultivated, silent yet meaningful. The carved figure on his desk had become more than a companion. It was a witness, a steady presence acknowledging the quiet accumulation of patience, effort, and observation. Each sketch, each note, each small act of creation contributed to a narrative of growth that existed even when unseen. Recognition, he realized, was not a prerequisite for value. Presence and attentive care were already forms of acknowledgement, sufficient and sustaining in themselves. Later, walking back through the streets, he noticed a fleeting interaction with a neighbor tending a flower. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words, a quiet exchange of awareness that warmed his chest. Squidward felt the subtle power of such moments, small threads of connection that, though often overlooked, wove together into a tapestry of shared attention. These understated exchanges reminded him that connection did not always need to be overt or elaborate. Sometimes it existed quietly, in acknowledgement alone. Back at home, Squidward set the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced the contours of its shape, whispering softly, "We continue slowly and deliberately, and that is enough." The figure seemed to absorb the sentiment, a silent affirmation of the value of persistence and patient observation. He understood now that life's melody was constructed note by note through each careful, intentional act, each small gesture, each attentive moment. Each melody played for its own sake contributed to the quiet, enduring rhythm of his life. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore, letting the clarinet rise in deliberate arcs. The stars scattered above reflected in the water below, creating a soft, infinite dialogue of light and movement. Squidward allowed himself a long exhale, feeling the satisfaction of a day attended to fully and meaningfully. Finally, he returned home, lying down with a sense of calm assurance. The quiet rhythm of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly towards sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey was ongoing, unfolding gently, steadily, in notes, pauses, and quiet awareness, forming the next step in the melody of his life. The morning arrived with a quiet light, soft and diffused, as though the world itself exhaled before beginning its day. Squidward stirred slowly, feeling the familiar rhythm of the tide in his chest, a gentle pulse that had become part of him over months of observation, reflection, and music. Sunlight filtered through his window in thin, golden streams, illuminating the sand and water beyond with a tender glow. For a moment he lingered, savoring the calm and the subtle promise of the day. Growth, he had learned, was not loud or sudden. It emerged in these unhurried moments, layered quietly upon itself, accumulating with patience and attention. He dressed with care, each gesture deliberate, grounding himself in the present. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, waiting like an old companion. Squidward lifted it, feeling the familiar coolness of the keys and the gentle weight of the wood in his hands. Today, he decided, he would play with a focus not on perfection but on presence. Each note would be an observation, a reflection of the world around him, the sway of kelp, the shimmer of sunlight on the water, the small details that often went unnoticed but held their own quiet significance. Music, he knew, was less about performing than about listening, attuning oneself to subtle rhythms both within and around him. Walking toward the shore, he noticed the small miracles that often went unremarked. A cluster of shells arranged by the tide, the slow dance of seaweed in the current, a school of fish flickering beneath the surface in a burst of iridescence. He paused frequently, letting these details settle in his mind and merge with the music he would soon play. These subtleties were teachers, offering lessons in patience, attentiveness, and the quiet joy of simply noticing the world. They reminded him that connection did not always require words or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived softly, in shared rhythm and attention. Settling on his usual rock, Squidward lifted the clarinet to his lips, letting the first notes rise. They were soft at first, hesitant, curling around the natural rhythm of the waves. Then they grew with quiet confidence, forming arcs of sound that intertwined with the ebb and flow of the tide. Every pause, every tremor in his fingers was deliberate, a meditation on imperfection and honesty. The music was not meant to impress, but to exist, to echo the subtle, ongoing patterns of life around him. In this interplay, he felt a rare harmony, a sense of alignment with the small, persistent rhythms of the world. As he played, his mind wandered to the quiet relationships he had cultivated. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, was a steadfast witness to his patient persistence. Each sketch, each note, each small act of creation built a bridge between himself and the world. Recognition was not necessary for value. The act of attentive presence itself was sufficient. Even fleeting exchanges, a glance from a neighbor, a nod to a bird perched on a post, held quiet significance. Life, he realized, was stitched together from these understated threads, forming a tapestry of care, attention, and subtle connection. Later, walking back through the deserted streets, he noticed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words, a small act of recognition that warmed his chest. Squidward felt the quiet reassurance of being noticed, of participating in the world through attentiveness rather than performance. Connection, he understood, was often subtle, and sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. Back in his room, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced its edges softly. We continue, slowly, carefully. "And that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to absorb the sentiment, a silent affirmation of the patient accumulation of growth, attention, and care. Squidward understood that life's melody was composed note by note, moment by moment, observation by observation. Each deliberate act, each attentive pause, contributed to a rhythm that endured beyond immediate perception. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in soft, deliberate arcs, blending with the gentle pulse of the waves. Stars mirrored themselves faintly in the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the quiet persistence of his journey. He allowed a deep, full exhale to settle into his chest, the calm satisfaction of a day fully observed and fully lived. Finally, returning home, Squidward lay down with a gentle serenity, the quiet rhythms of attention, observation, and creation cradling him. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered softly, "We continue." And that is enough. The journey was ongoing, unfolding gently, steadily, in notes, pauses, and quiet awareness, each moment forming the next step in the slow, deliberate melody of his life. The morning arrived with the soft certainty of rhythm, a calm unfolding that seemed to stretch time itself. Squidward awoke slowly, listening to the faint tug of the tide echoing in his chest, a pulse that had become as familiar and necessary as his own heartbeat. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in thin golden slivers, brushing the floor with gentle warmth. He lingered for a moment, letting the quiet seep into him, a reminder that growth often moves imperceptibly, layering upon itself like sand building slowly along the shore. Each small act of attention, each patient observation, added up over time, creating a melody that could only be felt and not rushed. He dressed deliberately, letting each movement anchor him in the present. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure, waiting like an old friend. Squidward lifted it, feeling the cool keys beneath his fingers and the familiar weight of the wood against his palms. Today, he resolved, he would let the music unfold naturally, allowing the tides of melody and observation to guide him. He understood that the notes were not merely sounds, but reflections of the subtle rhythms surrounding him. The sway of kelp in the tide, the shimmer of sunlight on the water, the quiet pulse of life that went largely unnoticed, yet carried its own persistence. Walking toward the shore, Squidward's attention was caught by the small details that had become part of his daily communion with the world. A ripple in the sand left by retreating water, the iridescence of a passing fish, a faint whisper of wind moving through the kelp. He paused often, letting these small observations settle in his mind, merging with the music he was about to play. These details, once background noise, now carried meaning. They were teachers of patience, empathy, and the quiet power of noticing the world without trying to control it. Settling onto his usual rock, Squidward raised the clarinet and allowed the first notes to rise. They were soft and deliberate, curling around the rhythm of the waves. Gradually, the melody grew richer, forming arcs that intertwined with the subtle cadence of the tide. Each pause, each faltering breath became intentional, a meditation on imperfection and authenticity. He played not to impress, but to witness and to honor the world's quiet movements. In this space he felt the rare harmony of alignment, music, observation, and presence flowing seamlessly together, neither dominating the other, each note a soft acknowledgement of the life around him. As he played, his mind drifted to the bonds that had quietly shaped him. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, remained a steadfast companion, witnessing his persistence and patience. Each sketch, each note, each careful act of creation was a thread connecting him to a larger tapestry, subtle and unassuming, but imbued with meaning. Recognition, Squidward realized, was not necessary for value. The act of attentive creation, of being present, was enough. Even fleeting interactions like a neighbor's nod or a bird pausing nearby carried profound significance when noticed fully. Later, walking back through the quiet streets, Squidward observed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words. He felt the warmth of connection, a small yet enduring reminder that presence and attentiveness could resonate quietly, creating bonds without ceremony or declaration. These understated moments, subtle and almost imperceptible, formed a network of quiet understanding that Squidward had grown to treasure. Back at home, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and ran a finger along its curves. "We continue softly, deliberately, and that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to respond, absorbing his words as a silent affirmation of the patient accumulation of effort, care, and observation. Life's melody, he reflected, was constructed note by note, moment by moment. Each act of attention, each intentional pause, contributed to a rhythm that endured beyond immediate perception, forming a quiet legacy of persistence and presence. As night fell, Squidward returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in gentle arcs, each note deliberate, each pause intentional. The stars mirrored themselves faintly in the water, scattered points of light that seemed to acknowledge the steady persistence of his journey. He let a slow, full exhale settle through his chest, the calm satisfaction of a day fully observed, fully lived, and fully attended to. Finally, he returned home, lying down with a gentle serenity. The quiet rhythms of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly into sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey remained ongoing, unfolding softly, steadily, in notes, pauses, and attentive observation, each moment forming the next step in the enduring melody of his life. The morning arrived with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world had decided to move slowly, to linger on the small details that often go unnoticed. Squidward awoke gradually, the gentle tug of the tide already resonating in his chest, a pulse as steady and familiar as his own breathing. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, scattering warm streaks across the sand outside. For a long moment he remained still, letting the quiet settle into him. Growth, he knew, unfolded in these unhurried stretches of time. It came not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of patient observation, thoughtful attention, and the subtle weaving of daily moments into a tapestry of understanding. He dressed with care, each movement deliberate, grounding himself in the present. The clarinet waited beside the carved figure on his desk, a patient companion. Squidward lifted it, feeling the cool keys beneath his fingers, the familiar weight of the instrument pressing gently into his palms. Today, he resolved, he would play with attention, not with expectation. Each note would be a reflection of the subtle rhythms around him, the sway of kelp in the tide, the shimmer of sunlight on water, the quiet insistence of life continuing in soft, unobserved ways. Music had become less a performance and more a conversation with the world, a dialogue of patience, presence, and delicate resonance. Walking toward the shore, Squidward noticed the small, nearly invisible movements that had become central to his understanding. The ripple of sand beneath shallow waves, the glint of fish scales catching sunlight, the faint sigh of wind through the kelp. He paused often, letting these small observations settle within him. Each detail, once background noise, now carried its own subtle instruction, lessons in patience, attentiveness, and the gentle power of simply noticing. These rhythms of the world, persistent yet understated, mirrored his own steady accumulation of growth, practice, and quiet reflection. Settling on his usual rock, Squidward raised the clarinet and let the first notes emerge. They were soft, deliberate, curling around the cadence of the waves, intertwining with the small, persistent rhythms of the shore. Gradually, the melody expanded, shaped by his attentiveness and the subtle cues of the environment. Each pause, each falter in his fingers was a deliberate moment of reflection. He played not to impress, not to perform, but to witness, to honor the ongoing patterns of life and presence. There was harmony in this alignment, music, observation, and patience moving together, neither forcing the other, each note a quiet acknowledgement of the world around him. As he played, Squidward's mind wandered to the quiet connections he had cultivated. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, was a steadfast witness to his journey. Each sketch, each note, each careful act of creation formed a bridge between himself and the world. Recognition was unnecessary. Attentive presence alone carried meaning. Even fleeting interactions, a neighbor's nod, a bird's pause on a branch, formed subtle threads of connection, small but enduring, weaving a quiet web of understanding that gave his days structure and warmth. Later, wandering back through the streets, Squidward noticed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words, a small, quiet confirmation that he existed in the attention of others, even without deliberate acknowledgement. These understated moments reminded him that connection often required no grand gestures, only attentiveness and care. Presence, he realized, could be as profound as action, and observation as meaningful as speech. Back at home, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced its curves, whispering softly, "We continue patiently and deliberately, and that is enough." The figure seemed to hold the sentiment, a silent affirmation of the quiet accumulation of effort, observation, and reflection. Squidward understood now that life's melody was constructed note by note, observation by observation. Each small act of attention, each deliberate pause, contributed to a rhythm that endured beyond immediate perception, forming a subtle yet persistent legacy of presence. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in gentle arcs, deliberate and meditative, blending with the steady rhythm of the waves. The stars mirrored themselves faintly in the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the quiet persistence of his journey. He allowed himself a long exhale, the calm satisfaction of a day fully observed, fully attended to, and fully lived. Finally, Squidward returned home, lying down with a gentle serenity. The quiet rhythms of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly toward sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey remained ongoing, unfolding softly, steadily, in notes, pauses, and attentive observation, each moment forming the next step in the quiet, enduring melody of his life. The morning arrived like a soft whisper, delicate and unhurried, as if the world itself had decided to linger on its smallest details. Squidward awoke slowly, feeling the familiar pull of the tide within his chest, a rhythm that had grown inseparable from his own heartbeat. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in pale golden slivers, scattering across the sand and water beyond. For a long moment he allowed himself to linger, absorbing the calm, the gentle promise of the day. He had come to understand that growth was rarely sudden. It arrived quietly, accumulating in patient observation, deliberate attention, and small acts repeated over time. He dressed with care, each movement deliberate and mindful. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, waiting like an old friend who understood him without words. Squidward lifted it, feeling the coolness of the keys beneath his fingers and the familiar weight of the instrument in his hands. Today, he resolved, he would allow the music to guide him rather than trying to control it. Each note would be a reflection of the subtle rhythm surrounding him, the sway of kelp in the tide, the glimmer of sunlight on the water, the quiet pulse of life that persisted largely unnoticed. Music had become less about performance and more about presence, a dialogue with the world that required attention, patience, and quiet observation. As he walked toward the shore, he noticed the small details that had become central to his life. The ripple of sand beneath the shallow waves, the shimmer of fish scales as they darted in fleeting synchrony, the gentle sigh of wind through the kelp. He paused frequently, letting these details settle into him, merging with the melodies he would soon play. These small, subtle elements were teachers, instructing him in patience, empathy, and the quiet joy of noticing without trying to control. They mirrored the slow accumulation of growth he had experienced over months of attentive practice, reflection, and careful observation. When he settled onto his usual rock, Squidward lifted the clarinet to his lips. The first notes emerged softly, curling around the cadence of the waves. Gradually, the melody expanded, shaped by his attentiveness and the natural rhythm of the environment. Each pause, each falter in his fingers became intentional, a meditation on imperfection and authenticity. He played not to impress, not for recognition, but to witness the subtle, persistent patterns of the world around him. Harmony arose naturally from alignment, music, observation, and presence flowing together. Each note a quiet acknowledgement of life's enduring rhythm. As the music continued, Squidward's mind drifted to the quiet bonds he had nurtured. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, remained a steadfast companion, witnessing the slow accumulation of effort, patience, and reflection. Each sketch, each note, each careful act of creation had become a thread connecting him to the world. Recognition, he realized, was not required for value. Attentive presence was already sufficient. Even fleeting exchanges, a neighbor's nod, a bird pausing nearby, formed subtle threads of connection, weaving a tapestry of quiet understanding that warmed his days. Later, wandering back through the empty streets, Squidward noticed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words. The moment carried warmth, a gentle reassurance that even the smallest gestures of attention and recognition could resonate profoundly. These understated moments, quiet and nearly imperceptible, were often more meaningful than overt declarations, forming the subtle network of connection that gave his days texture and purpose. Back at home, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced its contours with his fingers. "We continue, softly, patiently, and that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to hold the sentiment, a silent affirmation of the quiet accumulation of observation, reflection, and deliberate action. Squidward understood that life's melody was built note by note, observation by observation. Each small act of attention, each intentional pause, contributed to a rhythm that endured beyond immediate perception, forming a subtle, persistent legacy of presence. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in gentle, deliberate arcs, blending with the soft cadence of the waves. The stars reflected faintly in the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the quiet persistence of his journey. He allowed himself a long, deliberate exhale, the calm satisfaction of a day fully observed and fully attended to. Finally, Squidward returned home, lying down with a sense of gentle serenity. The quiet rhythms of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly toward sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey remained ongoing, unfolding softly, steadily. In notes, pauses, and attentive awareness, each moment forming the next step in the enduring, gentle melody of his life. The morning arrived slowly, tender and deliberate, as if the world had paused to exhale. Squidward stirred beneath the sheets, feeling the gentle pull of the tide echoing in his chest, a familiar rhythm that had become part of him over months of observation, reflection, and music. Sunlight streamed through the curtains in pale golden lines, illuminating the sand and water beyond with a calm, almost meditative glow. For a long moment he lingered, letting the stillness settle into him. Growth, he had learned, was rarely dramatic or immediate. It emerged in quiet stretches of time, in patient attention, and in the accumulation of small, deliberate actions repeated day after day. He dressed with care, letting each movement anchor him in the present. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, a patient companion that had witnessed countless hours of reflection. Squidward lifted it, feeling the cool keys beneath his fingers and the comforting weight of the instrument. Today, he resolved, he would let the music unfold naturally without trying to force it. Each note would carry the subtle rhythms he had been observing, the sway of kelp in the tide, the glimmer of sunlight on water, the quiet pulse of life around him. Music had become a form of meditation, a conversation with the world that required patience, presence, and attentive listening rather than perfection. Walking toward the shore, Squidward noticed the small, overlooked movements that had gradually become central to his days, the gentle ripple of sand beneath the shallow waves, the shimmering of fish as they darted through shafts of sunlight, the sigh of wind brushing against the kelp. He paused often, letting these subtle observations settle into him, forming a quiet narrative that merged with the music he would play. These small, fleeting details were teachers, guiding him in patience, empathy, and the quiet joy of noticing without interference. They mirrored the accumulation of his own growth, patience, and careful attention over time. Settling on his usual rock, Squidward lifted the clarinet and let the first notes rise. They were soft, curling gently around the rhythm of the waves, hesitant yet deliberate. Gradually, the melody expanded, shaped by his awareness of the environment and his own internal rhythm. Each pause, each faltering breath was deliberate, a meditation on authenticity and imperfection. He played not to impress, not for recognition, but to witness and honor the subtle, ongoing patterns of life around him. In this quiet alignment, harmony emerged naturally. Music, observation, and presence intertwined, each note a soft acknowledgement of the enduring rhythm of the world. As he played, Squidward's thoughts turned to the quiet bonds he had nurtured over time. The carved figure on his desk remained a steadfast companion, silently witnessing the accumulation of patience, reflection, and attentive action. Each sketch, each note, each small act of creation had become a thread connecting him to the world. Recognition, he realized, was unnecessary. Attentive presence alone carried significance. Even fleeting exchanges, a neighbor's nod, a bird's pause on a branch, a ripple in the sand, were threads in a subtle web of connection that gave his days warmth and depth. Later, walking back through the quiet streets, Squidward observed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their gaze lingered briefly, acknowledging him without words. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a reassurance that attentiveness and presence could resonate even in the smallest gestures. These understated interactions often carried more meaning than grand acts, forming a tapestry of gentle understanding and connection that he had come to cherish. Back at home, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced its contours with his fingers. "We continue softly, patiently, and that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to hold the sentiment, a silent affirmation of the quiet accumulation of attention, observation, and deliberate action. Squidward understood that life's melody was constructed note by note, observation by observation. Each small act, each pause, each mindful moment contributed to a rhythm that endured beyond immediate perception, creating a subtle and enduring legacy of presence. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in gentle, deliberate arcs, blending with the soft cadence of the waves. Stars mirrored themselves faintly in the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the persistence and quiet devotion of his journey. He let a long, slow exhale settle into him, the calm satisfaction of a day observed and lived fully. Finally, Squidward returned home, lying down with a gentle serenity. The quiet rhythms of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly towards sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." The journey remained ongoing, unfolding softly, steadily, in notes, pauses, and attentive awareness, each moment forming the next step in the enduring, gentle melody of his life. The morning arrived with a gentle hush, as if the world itself had chosen to linger just a moment longer before beginning its day. Squidward awoke slowly, feeling the familiar pull of the tide in his chest, a quiet rhythm that had become inseparable from his own heartbeat over months of patient observation and reflection. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the sand outside. For a long moment, he allowed himself to remain still, absorbing the calm and the subtle promise of the day. He had learned that growth rarely arrives suddenly. It comes quietly, accumulating in attentive observation, deliberate actions, and small, repeated gestures over time. He dressed with care, each movement grounding him in the present. The clarinet rested beside the carved figure on his desk, waiting like a faithful companion. Squidward lifted it, feeling the familiar coolness of the keys beneath his fingers and the reassuring weight of the wood in his hands. Today, he resolved, he would let the music arise naturally, allowing the melody to flow from the accumulated awareness of the world around him. Each note would carry the subtle rhythms he had come to notice, the sway of kelp, the glimmer of sunlight on water, the quiet insistence of life moving on, persistent and unobserved. Music, he realized, had become less about performance and more about conversation. With the world, with himself, and with the invisible strands connecting all things. Walking toward the shore, he paused often, noticing the small details that had become central to his days, the delicate ripple of sand beneath the waves, the fleeting flicker of a fish glinting in the sun, the gentle sigh of wind moving through the kelp. Each observation settled within him, merging with the music he would soon play. These subtle, often overlooked movements were teachers, instructing him in patience, attentiveness, and the quiet joy of simply noticing. They reflected the slow accumulation of growth, reflection, and deliberate care that had shaped him over time. Settling onto his usual rock, Squidward lifted the clarinet to his lips. The first notes emerged softly, curling gently around the natural rhythm of the waves. Gradually, the melody expanded, shaped by his attentiveness and the quiet pulse of the environment. Each pause, each slight tremor became a meditation on imperfection, presence, and authenticity. He played not to impress, not for recognition, but to honor the subtle, persistent patterns of life. In this space, music, observation, and awareness intertwined, creating a gentle harmony that spoke of quiet perseverance, patience, and attentiveness. As the melody continued, Squidward reflected on the bonds that had quietly shaped him. The carved figure on his desk, though silent, had witnessed countless hours of patient observation and careful creation. Each sketch, each note, each small act of deliberate attention had become a thread connecting him to the world. Recognition was unnecessary. Attentive presence alone carried meaning. Even fleeting moments, a neighbor's nod, a bird pausing nearby, a ripple in the sand, formed a delicate web of connection, subtle but enduring, that gave his days depth and warmth. Later, walking back through the quiet streets, Squidward noticed a neighbor tending a small garden. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging each other without words. He felt a quiet reassurance in that gesture, a gentle confirmation that presence and attentiveness could resonate, even in the smallest, most understated ways. Connection, he realized, did not require grand gestures. Sometimes it existed quietly, in attention, observation, and care. Back at home, he placed the clarinet beside the carved figure and traced its contours with his fingers. "We continue softly, patiently, and that is enough," he whispered. The figure seemed to absorb the sentiment, a silent witness to the patient accumulation of growth, reflection, and deliberate action. Squidward understood that life's melody was built note by note, observation by observation, gesture by gesture. Each deliberate act, each attentive pause, each careful observation contributed to a rhythm that endured, forming a subtle but lasting legacy of presence. As night fell, he returned once more to the shore. The clarinet rose in gentle, deliberate arcs, blending with the soft cadence of the waves. Stars mirrored themselves faintly in the water, scattered points of light acknowledging the quiet perseverance of his journey. He allowed a long, slow exhale to settle through his chest, the calm satisfaction of a day fully observed, fully lived, and fully attended to. Finally, Squidward returned home, lying down with gentle serenity. The quiet rhythms of patience, observation, and creation cradled him, carrying him softly towards sleep. Tracing the carved figure one last time, he whispered, "We continue, and that is enough." And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man.